The history of capitalism can be traced back to early forms of merchant capitalism practiced in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. It began to develop into its modern form during the early modern period in the Protestant countries of northwestern Europe, especially the Netherlands and England. Traders in Amsterdam and London created the first chartered joint stock companies, driving up commerce and trade, and the first stock exchanges and banking and insurance institutions were established. Over the course of the past 500 years, capital has been accumulated by a variety of different methods, in a variety of scales, and associated with a great deal of variation in the concentration of economic power and wealth. Much of the history of the past 500 years is concerned with the development of capitalism in its various forms. Since 2000, a new scholarly field of history of capitalism has appeared, with courses in history departments. It includes topics such as insurance, banking and regulation, the political dimension, and the impact on the middle classes, the poor and women and minorities. Origins of capitalism. Crisis of the 14th century. According to some historians, the modern capitalist system has its origin in the crisis of the 14th century, a conflict between the landowning aristocracy and the agricultural producers, the serfs. Manorial arrangements inhibited the development of capitalism in a number of ways, because serfs had obligations to produce for lords. They had no interest in technological innovation, because serfs produced to sustain their own families. They had no interest in cooperating with one another, because lords owned the land. They relied on force to guarantee that they were provided with sufficient food, because lords were not producing to sell on the market. There was no competitive pressure for them to innovate. Finally, because lords expanded their power and wealth through military means, they spent their wealth on military equipment or on conspicuous consumption that helped foster alliances with other lords. They had no incentive to invest in developing new productive technologies. The demographic crisis of the 14th century upset this arrangement. This crisis had several causes. Agricultural productivity reached its technological limitations and stopped growing. Bad weather led to the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. The Black Death in 1348 to 1350 led to a population crash. These factors led to a decline in agricultural production. In response, feudal lords sought to expand agricultural production by expanding their domains through warfare. They therefore demanded more tribute from their serfs to pay for military expenses. In England, many serfs rebelled. Some moved to towns, some purchased land, and some entered into favorable contracts to rent lands from lords who needed to repopulate their estates. The collapse of the manorial system in England created a class of tenant farmers with more freedom to market their goods and thus more incentive to invest in new technologies. Lords who did not want to rely on rents could buy out or evict tenant farmers, but then had to hire free labor to work their estates, giving them an incentive to invest in two very different kinds of commodity owners. On the one hand, the owners of money, means of production and subsistence, who are eager to valorize the sum of value they have appropriated by buying the labor power of others. On the other hand, free workers, the sellers of their own labor power, and free workers, in the double sense that they neither form part of the means of production nor do they own the means of production that transformed land and even money into what we now call capital. Marx labeled this period the prehistory of capitalism. In effect, feudalism began to lay some of the foundations necessary for the development of mercantilism, a precursor to capitalism. Feudalism took place mostly in Europe and lasted from the medieval period up through the 16th century. Feudal manors were almost entirely self-sufficient, and therefore limited the role of the market. This stifled any incipient tendency towards capitalism. However, the relatively sudden emergence of new technologies and discoveries, particularly in the industries of agriculture and in exploration, facilitated the growth of capitalism. The most important development at the end of feudalism was the emergence of what Degan calls the dichotomy between wage earners and capitalist merchants. With mercantilism, the competitive nature means there are always winners and losers. And this is clearly evident as feudalism transitions into mercantilism, an economic system characterized by private or corporate ownership of capital goods, by investments that are determined by private decision, and by prices, production, and the distribution of goods that are determined mainly by competition in a free market. Rise of towns. The transition from the feudal organization of society to early forms of capitalism happened in periods differing from country to country. According to Cambridge political philosopher and historian Quentin Skinner, the towns of North Italy were the first urbanized parts of Europe from the 12th century. German Bishop Otto of Freising recorded the growth of town life there, the loyalty of landed nobility to town authorities, and the emergence of republicanism and belief in civic liberty. Agrarian capitalism and enclosure. England in the 16th century was already a centralized state, in which much of the feudal order of medieval Europe had been swept away. This centralization was strengthened by a good system of roads and a disproportionately large capital city, London. The capital acted as a central market hub for the entire country, creating a very large internal market for goods, instead of the fragmented feudal holdings that prevailed in most parts of the continent. The economic foundations of the agricultural system were also beginning to diverge substantially. The manorial system had broken down by this time, and land began to be concentrated in the hands of fewer landlords with increasingly large estates. Instead of a serf-based system of labor, workers were being employed as part of a broader and expanding money economy. The system put pressure on both the landlords and the tenants to increase the productivity of the agriculture to make profit. The weakened coercive power of the aristocracy to extract peasant surpluses encouraged them to try out better methods, and the tenants also had incentive to improve their methods, in order to flourish in an increasingly competitive labor market. Terms of rent for the land were becoming subject to economic market forces rather than the previous stagnant system of custom and feudal obligation. An important aspect of this process was the enclosure of the common land held in the open field system, where peasants had traditional rights, such as mowing meadows for hay and grazing livestock. Once enclosed, these uses of the land became restricted to the owner, and it ceased to be land for commons. The process of enclosure began to be a widespread feature of the English agricultural landscape during the 16th century. By the 19th century, unenclosed commons had become largely restricted to rough pasture in mountainous areas and to relatively small parts of the lowlands. Marxist and neo-Marxist historians argue that rich landowners used their control of state processes to appropriate public land for their private benefit. This created a landless working class that provided the labor required in the new industries developing in the north of England. For example, in agriculture, the years between 1760 and 1820 are the years of wholesale enclosure, in which, in village after village, common rights are lost. Enclosure was a plain enough case of class robbery. Other scholars argue that the better-off members of the European peasantry encouraged and participated actively in enclosure, seeking to end the perpetual poverty of subsistence farming. We should be careful not to ascribe to enclosure developments that were the consequence of a much broader and more complex process of historical change. The impact of 18th and 19th century enclosure has been grossly exaggerated. Merchant capitalism and mercantilism precedents the earliest recorded activity of long-distance profit-seeking merchants can be traced back to the old Assyrian merchants active in the 2nd millennium BCE. The Roman Empire developed more advanced forms of commerce, and similarly widespread networks existed in Islamic nations. But capitalism took shape in Europe in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. However, while trade has existed since early in human history, it was not capitalism. An early emergence of commerce occurred on monastic estates in Italy and France and in the independent city republics of Italy during the late Middle Ages. Innovations in banking, insurance, accountancy, and various production and commercial practices linked closely to a spirit of frugality, reinvestment, and city life, promoted attitudes which sociologists have tended to associate only with Northern Europe, Protestantism and a much later age. The city republics maintained their political independence from empire and church, traded with North Africa, the Middle East and Asia, and introduced Eastern practices. They were also considerably different from the absolutist monarchies of Spain and France, and were strongly attached to civic liberty. Emergence. Modern capitalism, however, only fully emerged in the early modern period between the 16th and 18th centuries. With the establishment of mercantilism or merchant capitalism. Early evidence for mercantilistic practices appears in early modern Venice, Genoa, and Pisa over the Mediterranean trade in bullion. The region of mercantilism's real birth, however, was the Atlantic Ocean. England began a large-scale and integrative approach to mercantilism during the Elizabethan era. An early statement on national balance of trade appeared in Discourse of the Commonweal of this Realm of England, 1549. We must always take heed that we buy no more from strangers than we sell them, for so should we impoverish ourselves and enrich them. The period featured various but often disjointed efforts by the court of Queen Elizabeth to develop a naval and merchant fleet capable of challenging the Spanish stranglehold on trade and of expanding the growth of bullion at home. Queen Elizabeth promoted the Trade and Navigation Acts in Parliament and issued orders to her navy for the protection and promotion of English shipping. These efforts organized national resources sufficiently in the defense of England against the far larger and more powerful Spanish Empire, and in turn paved the foundation for establishing a global empire in the 19th century. The authors noted most for establishing the English mercantilist system include Gerard de Melanesia and Thomas Munn, who first articulated the Elizabethan system. The latter's England's treasure by foreign trade, or the balance of our foreign trade is the rule of our treasure, gave a systematic and coherent explanation of the concept of balance of trade. It was written in the 1620s and published in 1664. Mercantile doctrines were further developed by Josiah Child. Numerous French authors helped to cement French policy around mercantilism in the 17th century. French mercantilism was best articulated by Jean-Baptiste Colbert, although his policies were greatly liberalized under Napoleon. Doctrines under mercantilism. European merchants, backed by state controls, subsidies, and monopolies, made most of their profits from the buying and selling of goods. In the words of Francis Bacon, the purpose of mercantilism was the opening and well-balancing of trade, the cherishing of manufacturers, the banishing of idleness, the repressing of waste and excess by sumptuary laws, the improvement and husbanding of the soil, the regulation of prices. Similar practices of economic regimentation had begun earlier in the medieval towns. Among the major tenets of mercantilist theory was bullionism, a doctrine stressing the importance of accumulating precious metals. Mercantilists argued that a state should export more goods than it imported so that foreigners would have to pay the difference in precious metals. Mercantilists asserted that only raw materials that could not be extracted at home should be imported, and promoted government subsidies, such as the granting of monopolies and protective tariffs, were necessary to encourage home production of manufactured goods. Proponents of mercantilism emphasized state power and overseas conquest as the principal aim of economic policy. If a state could not supply its own raw materials, according to the mercantilists, it should acquire colonies from which they could be extracted. Colonies constituted not only sources of supply for raw materials but also markets for finished products. Because it was not in the interests of the state to allow competition to help the mercantilists, colonies should be prevented from engaging in manufacturing and trading with foreign powers. Mercantilism was a system of trade for profit, although commodities were still largely produced by non-capitalist production methods. Noting the various pre-capitalist features of mercantilism, Karl Polanyi argued that mercantilism, with all its tendency toward commercialization, never attacked the safeguards which protected the two basic elements of production, labor and land, from becoming the elements of commerce. Thus, with mercantilism, regulation was more akin to feudalism than capitalism. According to Polanyi, not until 1834 was a competitive labor market established in England. Hence, industrial capitalism as a social system cannot be said to have existed before that date. Chartered trading companies. The Muscovy Company was the first major chartered joint-stock English trading company established in 1555, with a monopoly on trade between England and Muscovy. It was an offshoot of the earlier Company of Merchant Adventurers to New Lands, founded in 1551 by Richard Chancellor, Sebastian Cabot and Sir Hugh Willoughby to locate the Northeast Passage to China to allow trade. This was the precursor to a type of business that would soon flourish in England, the Dutch Republic and elsewhere. The British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company launched an era of large state-chartered trading companies. These companies were characterized by their monopoly on trade, granted by letters patent provided by the state. Recognized as chartered joint stock companies by the state, these companies enjoyed power, ranging from lawmaking, military, and treaty-making privileges. Characterized by its colonial and expansionary powers by states, powerful nation-states sought to accumulate precious metals, and military conflicts arose. During this era, merchants, who had previously traded on their own, invested capital in the East India Companies and other colonies, seeking a return on investment.